It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Iraqi troops alongside U.S. logistical support took over the last remaining road leading to western Mosul on Wednesday. The fight against ISIS in Iraq's second largest city has been particularly intense as the Iraqi military prepares to push ISIS out of western Mosul. The UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs estimates that about 46,000 residents fled Mosul between February 19th and March 7th. This was the largest number since the fighting began in Mosul in last October. Until now, about 250,000 residents have been displaced. It is estimated that another 750,000 remain in the western half of the city, where the humanitarian situation is extremely dire. Joining us now to assess the latest developments in the effort to retake Mosul is Sabah Alnasseri. Sabah is professor in political science at York University in Toronto. His latest publication is Arab Revolutions and Beyond, the Middle East and Reverberations in the Americas. Thank you so much for joining us, Sabah.
To be with you, Sharmini.
So, Sabah, reports indicate that the fight to retake Mosul from ISIS is entering a new phase. Now, ISIS has been pushed out of the eastern part of the city. It is expected that taking over the western half, however, of the city might be more difficult. Sunnis live there who might support ISIS, and because ISIS fighters are almost completely surrounded here and they have nowhere to go, so people might try to protect them. What is your assessment?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Iraqi army with the Kurdish Peshmerga and the anti-terror forces, the tribal forces, Shiite militias, and so on, after almost cleansing the eastern part of Mosul, they moved to the western part of the city, but where the majority of ISIL fighters actually situated, because it's the center of the caliphate beside Raqqa, the capital of the caliphate. So one correction here in the question, not the Sunni population in Mosul would probably support ISIS. This is not true. The population in Mosul are taken hostages by ISIL fighters, and they can barely move because of all the mines and shooting and explosive devices and so on. So their life is at risk. They are not supporting ISIS. But to suggest that the population in Mosul, because they are Sunni, somehow will support ISIS is wrong. I think it's this sectarian discourse is one of the problems we have.
And so then who might be supporting ISIS? Are there ISIS supporters in the civilian population there?
No, I mean, as I said, I mean, the ISIS fighter, they take civilian families as human shields, or they take them as hostages, because they knew that, you know, the Iraqi army will not bomb these narrow neighborhoods where the majority of the civilian population of Mosul lives. So they are taking the civil population as hostages. But the problem is not so much the civilian population as a human shields. It is ISIS in the eastern part of Mosul, which is the historical part of the city, a very narrow, tight streets and neighborhoods. They have developed in the last almost 3 years, since 2014, when they occupied Mosul, a complex maneuvering system, tunnel system throughout the city, where they can maneuver and wage surprise attack against the Iraqi army and so on. That's why the battle in the eastern part will be much more difficult, and a war of attrition, and will take longer than the fight in the eastern part of the city.
Right. So, Sabah, in the last few weeks, there's been so much of an exodus out of Mosul. Now, what is the current conditions? It must be really dire and unlivable.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, Sharmini, more than 250,000 people fled the city since October last year. And the problem is all 8 organizations are overwhelmed by this huge number of displaced population. They cannot accommodate them. So there's a bad situation in and outside of Mosul. And the second thing is, within the city itself, in the western and eastern part of the city, you know, liberating the city or defeating ISIS would mean, just like in Fallujah and Ramadi, that we will have a ghost cities, ruined cities. All the home infrastructures are destroyed. So people are living. I was reading a report the other day that a lot of family were living on rotten bread since days because they have nothing to eat. And since they cannot feed the city because of the bombing and being caught in between ISIL fighter and the Iraqi army, so we don't know how many people are injured. We don't know how many are killed because there is no civilian body count. Neither the Iraqis nor the US do civilian body counts. They do only body count for ISIL fighters to suggest how victorious this battle is and to cover up all other atrocities. So the situation is very difficult to estimate. Only after the fact, when ISIS is driven out of Mosul, we will really see the scope of the destruction and the disaster that people went through all these months.
Right. Now, when it comes to a situation like this, it's hard to talk about victories. I mean, there's no victories where people are suffering at this level. But do you think if the US and the Iraqis succeed in pushing ISIS out of Western Mosul, which could still take several months, I think, would this be the end of ISIS when it comes to the region?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, a lot of ISIS fighters left the city already, even before the battle started. And again, their toll system enabled them to flee the city and go to maybe to Syria or other villages outside of Mosul to regroup and attack again. You know, just today I was reading that in Kabul, an ISIL fighter, I think it was a suicide bomber, killed 30 people in the Kabul military hospitals. So they are dispersing their fight in Egypt and in Afghanistan or in other parts, in Syria, for instance. So I don't think, defeating ISIS in Mosul will be the end of ISIL. It will be, the end of one capital of ISIL's occupation of lands in Iraq and Syria.
Right. And then turning towards the West here in the United States. Now, as you know, President Trump recently reissued a new travel ban, but this time around he has left out Iraq from the list, but Iran, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, and Libya is still on the list. Now, was interesting that Iraq was on the list in the first place, given given the war in Iraq, and the Iraqis and the Americans have been fighting side by side in Iraq, and so this was questionable in the first place. But why do you think this time around it was left out of the list?
Right. Well, it was on the list in the first place because Trump suggested to his voters that the Iraqis should pay and should, cover some of the cost of the war, which the United States waged against Iraq and by Iraq, that the Iraqis should pay for that. So in a way to punish the Iraqis, and especially to punish the political elite with their massive wealth in the United States and Europe, and Trump, threatened to freeze all these assets to cover some cost of the war. Now, he realized from his generals, especially Mad Dog in Iraq, that if he keep Iraq on the list, and Iraqis are not allowed to enter the United States, and a lot of them, collaborated with the U.S. Army as translators, in the army, etc. That means this will complicate the war against ISIL, and it will turn the Tomorrow in Iraq against the United States and against the U.S. Army. So that means U.S. Army generals, advisors, consultant, trainer, etc., their life will be endangered. So I think he realized what a huge mistake he committed in the first place and took Iraq from the list. But still, the list is still actually a Muslim ban. He can define it as he wishes. It is a Muslim ban.
All right, Sabah, thank you so much for joining us today. There's much more to talk about, and looking forward to you joining us again very soon. Thank you.
Good to be with you, Sharmeen. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.